that our moral senses are intuitive rather than rational. One is that a lot of human decision making is intuitive. A lot of human decision making is intuitive. We make judgments left and right about things, we make snap judgments, often wrong. They're based on like oversimplifications of a complex world. You've heard of the book or read Thinking Fast and Slow. It's basically one of the key themes of the book. Is that human being decision making is deeply intuitive and it happens on like a momentary basis because that's just how human beings are able to process complex world. We cannot take in all the stimuli. We organize it in order to make sense. A lot of human decision making is intuitive. It's based on heuristics. It's based on oversimplifications or gut feeling in order for us to be able to get through a complex world. So while we're around the beginning, what moral decisions we get? We're not careful, rational thinkers, maybe. A lot of times we're simply instinctual, intuitive judgment makers. The second point here is that some social psychology experiments have shown that people's emotional states affect their moral decision making. If morality were rational, that would not be the case. You can expose someone, say, like a nasty smell. Like you go to psych lab, you are asked like grade a paper or something, right? You're exposed to like a nasty smell. And then those who are exposed to the nasty smell become part of the grade, right? It's an experiment you can establish what's out. It's very cool. People's critical judgments are affected by their emotional states and their exposure to stimuli that are pleasant or unpleasant. This kind of fun fact. It was like in the fall, in the first floor of this building, we're near the seating offices where I am, below my office, like directly below my office, something weirdly died. And I don't even remember this weird year. It stank the entire floor that day. If you were here that day, like, you knew something. And I did kind of wonder, like, if people were rating that day, I wonder if like the average grade got lower, it's like clearly. That's true, idea though, that our critical moral judgments are at least in part conditioned by our emotional state in our immediate environment. And morality or rational is not. The third point is that psychopaths can reason, but their emotional senses tend to be lacking. They're adept at reasoning, but their emotional senses tend to be lacking, like guilt, shame, compassion, etc. Stuff we're talking. Now, psychopaths in general tend to not be super great at moral decision making, but yet they're rational for being such that the head clearly rules the heart, or that close to not. If that's the case, and they tend to be kind of morally deficient as a group, I guess morally deficient, then morality is indeed rational. They should have a problem. But yet they do. They have a problem oftentimes making moral judgments. The final point here is that babies have an intuitive moral sense. If you've been around babies or very small children, you know that they have an intuitive moral sense. They can sense and perceive information about people and express preferences. They have an intuitive sense about things they like and don't like. But yet they can't. They're critical judgments. But they can't reason. Even small children seem to have the beginnings of intuitive moral sense, but they can't make rational judgments. So how can morality be rational if even babies? So the idea is that there seems to be quite a bit of evidence that human beings are highly intuitive in our decision making, our moral judgment. And in fact, that's arguably one of the key themes of this course as a whole. You talk about rational choice theory, but it seems like people suppress that rationality to make decisions. We have a whole conversation about rationality, at least 10 minutes maximizing ability. The fact that human beings can pursue actions that are not that we can very easily let our heart rule our head, make all the great kind of decisions. That's what there's lying in the first place points to the fact that moral decisions are emotional and intuitive rather than hyper-rational. They're not just a product of rationality. I'm totally convinced, and you probably get it. I'm totally convinced that there's so much about rationality, excuse me, about morality that is tied to emotion. A lot of theories point to this. A lot of theories are trying to talk about this. And situational action theory actually assumes we haven't even gotten to the moral filter has been passed when we talked about last time. That moral filter is an emotional filter. It's an intuitive moral sense. Like, would you pick up the wallet? Would you return it? That kind of thing. That's an intuitive moral judgment that she made. That wasn't super rational. Let's say it was a choice. It was an alternative that was viable. That you made it. Here's your thinking. So rationality came intuitive moral judgment. Situational action theory assumes this. And I think that. So that's the argument. That's the first one. Morality is intuitive, not rational. What happens with rationality is we make up rational excuses after. That's kind of what I'm trying to do to get incest example. You made intuitive moral judgment that it was extremely immoral. But trying to explain why was really deep. Again, making the judgment was really makes sense. This is the first point. The emotional dog is rational. Seems to be highly intuitive and not really rational. Really compatible. The second point is about, well, what morality is. What is morality in the first place? Jonathan Haidt and others have argued that we live in a weird society. A weird society. W-E-I-R, weird society. It's acronym for an initialism. That identifies people from countries that are Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic. Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic. And because they are Western, educated, industrial, rich, and democratic, they are unusual, globally seen. They are unusual. They are unique. They are actually weird. People from weird cultures are unique. Well, and this is sort of all of these social messages. Because we're rich, because we're Western, because we're educated, that affects and conditions the moral senses that, in general, all of us change. In general, on average, all of us change. In general, on average, people from weird country, weird culture, I would say these, tend to view ourselves as like independent, atomistic individuals. We tend to view ourselves as independent, atomistic individuals, and not as like embedded in complex social relationships in the street. You can clearly see this in like American culture, where we kind of identify and value rugged independence. But elsewhere you see this all Western educated, industrialized, and democratic culture. There's this emphasis on the individual. Actually, I mean, it's the period, but because of this, our moral sense, the kinds of behaviors we see as right and wrong, our moral sense is a little bit more limited. A little bit more limited. There's a reason why this is. One reason is because these types of cultures were in large part driven, at least the thinking surrounding this driven in large by enlightenment thinkers who indeed emphasize the importance of the individual. sort of separating the individual from these like tyrannical institutions that they have no control over. That we want to separate the individual. Like Protestant Reformation is about this. So it actually started before the Enlightenment. But the idea is that we have moral systems in these cultures that are sort of formed by the Enlightenment, this broad emphasis on the priority of the individual. That as a result, the things that we view as important in a moral sense are harm and fairness. Things that hurt people and things that are fair or unfair. Things that hurt people or things that are fair or unfair. Even young children, it seems, identify harm and fairness. Again, I have a 3-year-old who's so psycho. But she knows when a person hurts another person, other 3-year-olds hurt her, or she knows that that's wrong. It's really, I mean, I'm sort of responsible for a large part of raising my child. And she already has an intuitive sense, she did it last year, certainly, about what harm is. She also has a very clear sense about what fairness is. Who gets to turn on the iPad back then? She has an intuitive moral sense about those two things. Other stuff, not so much. So some people have argued, well, maybe that's the crux. Is harm and fairness. Harming other people, if unfairness, if and everything else is just sort of like later addressed. Everything else is just sort of like culture stuff. That's the argument. Some people think that way. That's not the case though in other. That's not the case in other non-weird cultures. What do we see in other non-weird cultures? We see a much greater sensitivity of the relationship and correspondence between the individual and institutions, between the individual and social contact, between the individual and social relationships, the individual and the groups to which they belong. Those types of non-weird cultures tend to emphasize those kinds of relationships more strongly to almost the detriment, perhaps, of the individual. So in non-weird societies, people are far more attuned to their duties and obligations to nation, to group, to tribe, to institution, to relationship. Much more attuned to things like loyalty and authority in ways that are just different on average in general in weird societies. And so as a result, a lot of moral rules in non-weird countries, maybe non-weird countries, concern things like purity and cleanliness and authority and loyalty, etc. Now you may not believe me, there is pure behavior, those of you study haven't done much of it at all, 1987. It was a survey of people in Chicago and a comparable survey of people who were living in Odessa. And so there was some overlap. There was some overlap in the types of behaviors that both groups of people viewed as moral and immoral. Morally acceptable and morally wrong, right? But then there were some clear areas in which the Venn diagram splits off. So you have some behaviors on this side and the left side where the Americans in Chicago would view the act as wrong, but the Indians in Odessa would view the act as morally acceptable. And on the other hand, you have these types of behaviors, which clearly somebody was familiar with Indian culture, especially in this specific region in India, where Americans would view these behaviors as acceptable, but the Indians living in Odessa would view them as incontroversially and clearly wrong, like 9s and 10s wrong, like clearly wrong, clearly morally unacceptable behaviors. The same way that many of you identify the incest attack. Sorry. Clearly wrong. So they're sort of curious as to where some of these come from. The one about eating fish, the argument that goes that fish can like make you sexually aroused, so we are doing that. But a lot of these relate to things like authority. like loyalty to groups and to issues about purity and cleanliness. Whereas on the other hand, if you ask that American view of law, we would view them